Hi, everybody, and welcome to Nelson Primary's webinar on teaching the significance of National Sorry Day and National Reconciliation Week using Our Land, Our Stories. I'll just give it another moment or so as people continue to join us, and then we'll jump into the housekeeping. All right, before we get started with the webinar, I'll just take you through some housekeeping. Firstly, you will notice that your camera and your microphone are turned off. That is just to minimize background noise because there are a few of you on the webinar today. If you do have any questions that come up during the webinar, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And if we can, we'll either respond to these during the session or follow up with you after the webinar. If you have any technical issues or you'd just like to have a chat, there is a chat button at the bottom of your screen as well, which my colleague Steph and I will be monitoring throughout the session. Finally, this webinar is being recorded today and you'll receive a copy of the recording in about a week's time. I will now introduce you to our presenter, Danielle Shaw. Danielle's extensive experience as a classroom teacher, spanning over 2 decades, has led her to specialise in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander education. She's also contributed to the development of a national educational series focusing on First Nations across Australia and provides professional learning opportunities to schools Australia-wide through engaging live webinars. In 2022, Danielle co-authored the 3 Our Land, Our Stories student activity books. Over to you, Danielle.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Kai. I'm coming to you from Awabakal country in Newcastle, Lake Macquarie. And I'd like to pay my respects to the elders, past and present, and acknowledge those who walked this land before us. And may we always tread carefully on our Aboriginal country. And if you'd like to, please put in the chat function the Aboriginal country or the land of the traditional owners that your school is located on. Okay, today we are looking at the 2024 National Sorry Day and Reconciliation with the theme Now More Than Ever. And before I explore this further, I just want to take a few moments to talk about Our Land, Our Stories and the important components that make up this remarkable resource. And if you've joined us for previous webinars, you will have heard this before. So this might be a good time to go and grab a cuppa and come back to us in just a couple of minutes. All right, quality assurance of using Our Land, Our Stories. Now, with this resource, you can be sure that you're using a meaningful and culturally appropriate resource. We can see on the timeline that AITSIS commissioned 39 First Nations authors to create the stories for the big books and reading cards. Now, this is what sets Our Land, Our Stories apart because these authors are telling you about their history, their family, their story as a First Nations Australian, rather than a third-person perspective you'll find in more generic resources and teacher subscriptions. Now, Our Land, Our Stories was officially launched at Parliament House, which again speaks volumes about the credibility of this resource. It is certainly a multi-award winning resource, being the winner of the Educational Publishing Awards Australia, Outstanding Primary winner, and Primary Student Resource winner. All right, now the complete series is broken into 3 levels. We have lower primary, middle primary, and upper primary, and each level comprises of 3 big books and 15 reading cards, as well as student activity book and teacher resource book to ensure best practice by teachers. And each level is broken into the components of country and place, culture, and people. Now, the lower primary series is mostly suited for infant students. With the middle and upper primary series, these levels can effectively be used in all primary and secondary grades. And the reason they are so adaptable to all age groups is because they offer such student-friendly versions of these really important topics and content. Okay, all resources explicitly link to the Australian Curriculum version 9, as well as current New South Wales syllabus outcomes and course content. And I developed 2 overviews so teachers can use a resource in a time-efficient way to ensure they have a diversified and culturally inclusive teaching program. And you can view these overviews online, and I'll get Jazz to email out the link to you all. Now, the first overview is organised in the course units from the New South Wales syllabus. So teachers can quickly locate which unit they are covering, and then they'll see the recommended stories that complement this unit. And it's not just the history units, but units from all KLAs which have been aligned to Our Land, Our Stories. Okay, and then with the second overview, each big book story and reading card has a brief description of concepts covered, and it's presented in point form for ease of reading. And teachers can easily skim through descriptions to find the story that's going to be most suitable. And this also has links to New South Wales syllabus outcomes. Okay, so today's webinar is exploring National Sorry Day and the 2024 Reconciliation Week theme, Now More Than Ever. Now, this year's National Sorry Day falls on this Sunday, the 26th of May, and it remembers and acknowledges the mistreatment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who were forcibly removed from their families and communities, which we now know as the Stolen Generations. Now, the first National Sorry Day was held on the 26th of May in 1998, and that was 1 year after the Bringing Them Home report was presented to Parliament. And this report detailed the history of the forced removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families under laws that were enforced by Australian governments. Okay, now the stories of pain and loss were written down and shared in the hope that the stolen generations could begin to heal from their experiences. Now, as a teacher myself across multiple schools, I always say to my students that National Sorry Day is not about putting blame on anyone or personally apologising for anything. Doing that's just going to make the divide wider rather than unifying our country. Rather, it's about everyone standing up, whether Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal, and saying there are things in our country's past that have happened and they should never have happened. Now, along with National Sorry Day, we also have Reconciliation Week, which begins on Monday, the 27th of May, and that's one day after National Sorry Day. Now, this date marks the anniversary of the 1967 referendum, where it was voted to remove clauses in the Australian Constitution that discriminated against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Reconciliation Week then ends on the 3rd of June, which marks the 1992 Mabo decision, where the High Court of Australia recognised native title. Okay, so the theme this year is Now More Than Ever. Now, when we look at the Reconciliation Australia website, we're given a really powerful message about this theme. And there are two paragraphs that particularly speak to me as an educator, which I've put in bold and you can see on your screen. And I've used these to inform our webinar today. And they read, now more than ever is a reminder to all of us that no matter what, the fight for justice and the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people will and must continue. And lastly, it says, now more than ever, the work continues in treaty making, in truth telling, in understanding our history, in education, and in tackling racism. We need connection, we need respect, we need action, and we need change. Now more than ever, we need reconciliation. Okay, now as we move through this webinar, we will navigate through 4 key focus areas. In focus 1, we will use our land, our stories for truth telling, some of our country's history, particularly within the space of stolen generations. Now these truths really help students to appreciate the huge significance and importance of reconciliation as a part of healing. In focus 2, we will use our land, our stories to explore significant Aboriginal peoples who have pioneered the path for reconciliation, particularly in the 20th century, by fighting for justice and the rights of their people. In focus 3, we will use our land, our stories as an educational tool to build the cultural competency of students and staff, which in turn helps address unconscious bias and racism. And in focus 4, we will use our land, our stories to investigate the strengthening of relationships through past and continuing steps towards reconciliation. Okay, so we start with our first focus. Now more than ever, the work continues in truth telling and understanding our history. Now, as I've just mentioned, we will use our land, our stories to help students appreciate the huge significance of reconciliation through truth telling, particularly in line with the national apology and stolen generations. Now, with such a sensitive topic like stolen generations, I highly recommend looking through the protocols and discussion points for each of these stories from the teacher resource book. Now, within truth telling of stolen generations, we're tying in with National Sorry Day, which acknowledges the strengths of stolen generation survivors and the healing process. Now, being National Sorry Day, I would certainly be incorporating the amazing storybook called Sorry Day by Coral Vass. Now, I've read this book to all students K to 6, and you really can lead such powerful discussion around the book to suit such a diverse range and age of students. Now, these next two stories from our Land Our Stories that we will explore in the webinar today are the perfect accompaniment to this very moving story, especially for our senior students. Okay, so the first story we're going to look at to help students' understanding of the stolen generations is The System of Protection from page 14 of the Upper Primary Country and Place Big Book. And this is written by Kate Habgood. Now, it explains how each colony was appointed a protector of Aborigines. Now, of course, the word Aborigines can be used as a derogatory word today, and its inclusion here exemplifies its use in the past. This story also details how the protection system was presented as something that would make sure Aboriginal people were looked after. But we learned that its true purpose was to end Aboriginal societies and for these cultures to become part of dominant European societies. We learned that the protection system existed until the 1970s with details of the prolific unfair treatment of Aboriginal peoples, and we also learned that it was the catalyst for the stolen generations. And an element from this story that I find extremely powerful is this photo of a Biripi woman holding up a sign that reads, "I'm a stolen child of a stolen child who has had a child stolen from me." Now, I've presented this photo before in a few past webinars, and that's because of how much it impacts me and my students. This photo and what it represents takes teachers and students from a culturally aware stance of just reading about the stolen generations to having a really empathetic response to a powerful first-hand account from a victim and survivor of the stolen generations. Now, the second story I find really helps students and teachers understand the actual impacts of the stolen generations is Assimilation to Live Like White People. And this is also from the Primary Country and Place Big Book on page 20. Now, this story starts by explaining the assimilation policy to students, and it then explores how many children were stolen from their parents with the purpose of forcing them to live like Europeans. And an element from this story that students find shocking is that under Queensland law, Aboriginal children could be taken away for neglect. And to be classed as a neglected child, you just had to have an Aboriginal mother. We've also given very personal account of being taken by Aboriginal woman V. McGuinness, who relays her own mother's experiences. And I found that giving my students these accounts of actual survivors of the stolen generations really helps them develop an understanding of why it is so important to recognise National Sorry Day and what it stands for. So within these two stories, students are presented with the information that removal of Aboriginal children from their families was the product of these two government policies. And reflecting on these stories, we have our activity pages from the Upper Primary Student Activity Book. Now, there are 3 student activity books, one for lower primary, one for middle primary, and one for upper primary. And these books were authored by myself and Sally Lawrence. Now, like I've said many times in past webinars, I often use these activities as a guide to inform what kind of learning experience I will provide for those students in front of me on that day. Sometimes we complete all the activities, but sometimes I take what's there and I modify it to suit the particular learning experience I'm aiming for. Okay, and now on page 12 of the Upper Primary Student Activity Book, we have the activities for System of Protection. Now here you could modify question 1 and have students use these words like protection, missions, stolen generations and guardians to help them explain what National Sorry Day means to them. Question 2b, I would use the wording in this question that explores the effects of removal on Aboriginal peoples to perhaps construct a class rationale for reconciliation. And in question 6, exploring the continued strength and resilience of First Nations cultures is perfect learning experience to link with reconciliation and the now more than ever theme. Okay, and page 14 of the student activity book, we have the activities for the story Assimilation to Live Like White People. And question 1 offers a great tool to help students consolidate terms around stolen generations and National Sorry Day. And I also love questions 5A and 5B, where students are presented with open-ended opportunities to give personal reflection to what they have read and understand. And it's through scaffolding these skills of empathy in our students that we are building pathways for successful leaders of tomorrow, particularly within the space of reconciliation. Okay, and this next story continues with focus 1 of truth-telling our country's history. So cultural impact of invasion from page 7 of the Upper Primary Culture Big Book by Lisa Fuller gives us a really good overall summary of how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures have been profoundly impacted by European arrival, but also how these cultures have always stayed strong and fought back which in turn highlights to students the relevance and importance of an ongoing reconciliation process and why walking together as one is needed in the path of reconciliation. In this story, students learned that until the 1967 referendum, Aboriginal Australians were classed as part of the native wildlife in this country. They learned how First Nations Australians across the country had to follow different rules that were controlled by very specific laws made just for them. This story also touches on the stolen generations and gives insight into how countless songlines have been broken and knowledge of many languages has been affected. This story, Cultural Impact of Invasion, really does embody this below excerpt that I'm about to read to you from the Reconciliation Australia website. And it reads, "Now more than ever, the work continues in truth-telling and understanding our history." Okay, now with the activities from page 38 of the student activity book, I love how just all of these questions encourage students to really consider and reflect on the realities of life for many First Nations Australians during this era. Again, developing students' empathetic skills and giving them tools to build meaningful understanding for why reconciliation is so important. Okay, so we're now moving to the next focus for our webinar, which explores the now more than ever reconciliation theme as a reminder to us all that no matter what, the fight for justice and the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people will and must continue. And so we'll use our Landau stories to explore significant Aboriginal peoples who have pioneered the path to reconciliation in the 20th century by enforcing justice and the rights of their people. We will focus on pioneers of the 20th century. However, we all know that since the day of British arrival to Australia, Aboriginal peoples have and continuously been fighting for their ancestral land, for recognition of their cultures and fighting for their rights as the original custodians of Australia and the oldest continuous civilization on earth. And now more than ever, we're being asked to continue their fight. Okay, so the story Campaigns in the 1960s from page 24 of the Upper Primary Country and Place Big Book can be linked really well to Reconciliation Week as it highlights many significant Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who have fought for recognition of their rights as First Nations Australians. This story talks of Charles Perkins and the Freedom Rides. It talks of the Yolngu people's fight against mining on their land with the 1963 Yirrkala Bark Petition and how this petition paved the way for the Mabo decision years later. It also offers students a summary of the 1967 referendum, which saw everyday Australian people becoming pioneers for reconciliation with their overwhelming yes vote. And on the flip side, it also offers students explanation of negative impacts for Aboriginal peoples as a result of this referendum. The story also gives students a brief account of the reconciliation pioneer, Vincent Lingari, and the Wave Hill Walk-Off, as well as those spearheading the Black Power movement, land rights, and the Aboriginal Embassy. Now, if you wanted to investigate these particular themes and campaigns further with students, I would certainly recommend following up this story with the Upper Primary Country and Place reading card, Black Power and the Aboriginal Embassy, written by Dr. Gary Foley. Okay, now many of the activities on page 21 of the student activity book really target the fight for justice and the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Now, these questions are a great starting point that you can extend upon and link to Reconciliation Week by reflecting on why this event is important in our reconciliation journey. For instance, in question 1, students could reflect on this question as is, and then consider why recognising and learning about the freedom rights is important for our country to move forward in reconciliation. Similarly, in question 6, how has the simple act of then Prime Minister Gough Whitlam pouring sand into Vincent Lingari's hand been a significant event for reconciliation in Australia? Okay, in keeping with the focus of significant Aboriginal peoples who have pioneered the path to reconciliation in the 20th century, we have our next story, Civil Rights Fighting for Equality, from the Upper Primary People Big Book, written by Jill McDougall. Now, within this story, students learn about 20th century advocates for change like Pearl Gibbs, one of the organisers for the first day of mourning, and students are given more information about Charles Perkins and the importance of the freedom rights. This story also introduces students to the extraordinary man Edward Koiki Mabo and what drove him to stand up and fight for land that had belonged to his people for thousands of years, but at the time ownership was claimed by the Queensland government. Okay, page 66 from the student activity book. We have more questions to help students reflect on this story. In linking this to Reconciliation Week, I love question 1A that reads, what basic civil rights were not provided to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples when Australia became a federation in 1901? And for students to gain an appreciation of the hardships faced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples within this question, it really does give more depth to students' understanding of why there were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples fighting for justice and the rights of their people. Now, you could certainly then consolidate this further by reflecting on the other questions from these activity pages. All right. And we also have political leaders from the Upper Primary People Big Book, which highlights Aboriginal political leaders who have been pioneers for reconciliation through their representation in the Australian Parliament. Students learn about Neville Bonner, who was Australia's first Aboriginal Member of Parliament and who for 12 years fought hard for the rights and better treatment of his people. Students also learn about Patrick or Pat Dodson, who led many important Indigenous organisations and was elected to represent Western Australia in the Senate for the Labor Party. And quite fittingly for Reconciliation Week, Pat Dodson was also chairman of the Council of Aboriginal Reconciliation, where he was given the title of Father of Reconciliation. Okay, and the story Land Rights Leading the Way, also from the Upper Primary People Big Book, offers more information about Vincent Lingari and the Wave Hill Walk-Off. And we can all connect the powerful Paul Kelly song, From Little Things Big Things Grow, with Vincent Lingari. And last year, as a beautiful Reconciliation Week ceremony, I played this song at each of my schools, and we really unpacked the meaning of these words. And this was assisted by this great summary of Vincent Lingari's life and legacy. Now, this story also gives students information about Edward Koiki Mabo with details of what motivated him to stand up and fight for land that had belonged to his people for thousands of years. Okay, now both these stories, political leaders and land rights leading the way, detail Aboriginal peoples who have pioneered the path to reconciliation in the 20th century and equally important have done so in the face of adversity. Now, we see this exemplified in question 2B from page 68 of the Upper Primary Student Activity Book, which asks, what does the Wave Hill strike tell us about the Gurindji people's strength and resilience? And I also love question 2A and 2B from page 69 that aligns to the political leader's story. Students are asked to unpack the hardships faced by Neville Bonner and how he overcame these to become a political leader. And here is a great opportunity to link to reconciliation by exploring how those like Neville Bonner, Vincent Lingari and the Gurindji people have and will continue the fight for justice and the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Okay, now when considering reconciliation, Edward Koiki Mabo is a really prominent figure. The Mabo judgment is a symbolic date which annually signifies the end of Reconciliation Week, and we can also view Edward Koiki Mabo as a pioneer for reconciliation with native title rights. And I love that our Land Our Story really celebrates him with various stories throughout the entire series. My co-author Sally Lawrence, who was instrumental in the formation of our Land Our Stories, lived among family members of Edward Koiki Mabo in the Torres Strait. So I know his story and legacy is quite close to Sal's heart. All right, the story, My Connection to Country from the Middle Primary Country and Place Big Book, written by Joanne Crawford, celebrates many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I particularly love the summary within this story of Edward Koiki Mabo's work. Now, when you really want to unpack the life and legacy of this extraordinary man, you can't go past the Koiki Mabo reading card from the Upper Primary Country and Place series, written by my co-author, the before-mentioned Sally Lawrence, who has that personal connection with the Mabo family. This card gives students details of him as a determined activist with a deep understanding of his culture, identity, and connection to country. Students learn that he's from Murray Island or Mer, which is an island community in the Torres Strait, and explains the importance of cultural identity that is connected to both the physical and spiritual landscape. In a really student-friendly manner, this card explains Malay law, which guides the people of Mer and their generational custodianship of the land. The card also gives student-friendly details about the Mabo case, so students can really appreciate the significance of these land rights as part of our country's history, but also in Australia's reconciliation journey. And I've used this card many times with students and will certainly be bringing it out again this Reconciliation Week. All right, and when we look at the activities that complement this story from page 30 of the Upper Primary Student Activity Book, I would certainly recommend using question 5 and 6 to align with reconciliation. Question 5 gives students more detail about the process of the Native Title Act and offers an opportunity for students to reflect on the importance for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to have the ownership of their traditional lands. And we can link this to the Now More Than Ever theme by considering what a huge step this has been in our country's reconciliation journey. Question 6, and I love that it simply asks students, if Edward Koiki Mabo were alive today and you could interview him, what 2 questions would you ask him? Okay, now we move into our next phase of exploring reconciliation used in our Land Our Stories through supporting students in building their own cultural competency. So now more than ever, the work continues in education. We must call out racism wherever we encounter it. And now for me, I believe that students and particularly staff being aware of their own unconscious cultural bias is a huge step towards reconciliation and a tool to better understand racism. Now, through our own upbringing and influences, we all have our own unconscious ideals. In the story What is Culture by Lisa Fuller, author of the Upper Primary Culture Big Book, on page 6, articulates beautifully what culture is and how we are influenced by what is the normal for us. And it also educates students on the influence of dominant culture in a society and how a minority culture sits within that, perfectly exemplified with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures as a now minority within a dominant society. It also explains that explains that Aboriginal Australians have one of the longest surviving cultures in the world and have been practicing the same cultural and spiritual beliefs for over 65,000 years. And this story then helps students put that into perspective by comparing this timeline with other world events. And similarly, the story First Nations Australians, also from the Upper Primary Culture Big Book on page 6, helps students build their competency by explaining appropriate language you can use when referring to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to respectfully encapsulate so many diverse cultures. Okay, and again, through our own upbringing and influences, we all have our own unconscious ideals, and these may include stereotyping of any culture. The Upper Primary Culture Reading Card, Stereotypes by Lisa Fuller, offers students a relatable summary of what stereotyping and racial profiling is, and also how the better we understand ourselves and realise the effect these ideas can have, the more we can move beyond our own unconscious bias. Now, I found that such a great resource. Now, I found this such a great resource for students because while it gives first-hand accounts of stereotyping and racial profiling experienced by First Nations peoples, it also offers explanation about how any minority group can experience this. Not only does it articulate the complexities of these issues in a way that students can easily understand, it also provides students with steps on what they can do within the space of stereotypes and racial profiling. Okay, and with the corresponding student activities, I love question 1 from page 53 of the Upper Primary Student Activity Book, as it helps consolidate students' learning by reiterating terms students have learnt. I love question 2 and 3 because it challenges students to consider and reflect on perceptions they may believe or have experienced within their own culture. And continuing on from this, continuing on with this focus of now more than ever, the work continues in education, we come to mistakes and misunderstandings from the Upper Primary Country and Place Big Book. Now, this is a simple one-page story, yet really powerful in the steps it offers towards reconciliation for both students and teachers. Now, this story explains that no one is perfect and everyone makes mistakes. It almost gives you permission to not have all the answers when within the space of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander education, but that's okay, and you can simply ask questions or apologise if you've accidentally offended someone. It also guides non-Aboriginal people and how they can respectfully interact with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community, which I know would definitely benefit students and teachers. Okay, and the joining activities from page 52 of the Upper Primary Student Activity Book are perfect to help students grow their own competency, which builds their understanding of the significance of reconciliation. And question 1 reads, why should you ask questions to develop your own understanding of the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples? Question 2, what 3 things should you do when you realise you've made a mistake? And question 3, reflect on a mistake you have made and what you've learnt from it. Now, these are fantastic activities to guide any personal growth in all students. Okay, and so we now move into the next focus of today's webinar, exploring past and continuing steps towards reconciliation. Now more than ever, we need to tackle the unfinished business of reconciliation. And the next stories will really unpack what events have unfolded within Australia and the steps towards reconciliation. But it's not all rainbows and unicorns, and students will discover in these stories that while we are moving in the right direction, there is still so much more to be done. These stories also help students reflect on past initiatives and how they haven't fixed everything as was planned, particularly when we look at the closing the gap targets. Now, for me, with my students, I will certainly be using this, excuse me, as a learning opportunity to highlight the need to reflect on past failings so that we can be more informed with future directives and what is needed for reconciliation. And we know with the push for cultural responsiveness, particularly in the classroom, moving forward with reconciliation means learning experiences will be inclusive of all cultures, and Aboriginal people will be paramount in making decisions and sharing insight for Aboriginal issues. So we'll look at the story Indigenous Action for Indigenous Rights from the Upper Primary Country and Place Big Book. Now, I find this story is a perfect springboard with introducing elements that are then unpacked in more detail with the following story we'll look at today, 2 Speeches for Reconciliation. Okay, so Indigenous Action for Indigenous Rights highlights that in the years since the campaigns of the 1960s, there have been leaps forwards, but also many steps backwards with reconciliation. And I love how both these stories walk students through key events that have shaped Australia's reconciliation journey in recent years within the reality of both the steps forward and steps backwards lens. Students learn of the importance of the Mabo judgment for moving forward in land rights, but also how the government made very strict requirements for native title claims. It highlights the 1988 bicentennial protests and how the then Prime Minister Bob Hawke promised a treaty. 35 years later, and a treaty is still on the table and a very current issue. It also highlights the importance of the 1992 Redfern speech by the then Prime Minister Paul Keating, where he admitted that the colonial invasion had caused great suffering to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And students learned that following this speech, the idea of reconciliation was then introduced into Parliament. And students learned that reconciliation meant, in theory, that Australia would improve the way that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are treated in Australia. It gives students a brief account of the 1997 Bringing Them Home report, and students also learn about protests calling for the government to apologise to the stolen generations, which became widespread, and we then learn about Kevin Rudd's national apology in 2008. The story then reinforces the significance of National Sorry Day as a nation moving forward in reconciliation. And again, it would be occasions like this that I remind my students, Sorry Day is not about placing blame or personally apologising. It's about saying these things happened and they should never have happened. Okay, and the accompanying activities from page 23 of the Upper Primary Student Activity Book are a fantastic complement to this story. Question 1 speaks of broken promises in regard to bilingual schools from the story, which, like many stories in this series, also has a QR code to watch a video about a bilingual school in Arnhem Land. Now, bilingual schools, in my opinion, are culturally responsive schools in action, building pathways to reconciliation. Now, thankfully, there are numerous bilingual schools now in existence, and this question would be the perfect starting base for a research task investigating how the increasing number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander bilingual schools are having a positive impact in communities. Question 3A and B also speaking to the very current issue of a treaty, which is becoming more and more pivotal in our reconciliation journey. And as I said, the perfect progression from this story, Indigenous Action for Indigenous Rights, is the upper primary reading card, 2 Important Speeches for Reconciliation by Kate Habgood. Now, Kate provides students with a thorough but easily understood explanation of reconciliation and how there are two speeches in our country's history which have been instrumental in the reconciliation process. The first of these speeches is the 1992 Redfern speech by then Prime Minister Paul Keating. And within this card, students learn how this speech was seen as a catalyst for change and thought of as the beginning of reconciliation. But it also reiterates to students the many broken promises from this time. And while this speech was important and many people admired it, it really did not lead to major improvements for Aboriginal people. Kate Habgood again addresses the 1998 promise of a treaty by then Prime Minister Bob Hawke, who didn't keep this promise and instead supported the idea of reconciliation. Now, this really is such a current idea as the 2024 reconciliation theme reads, now more than ever, the work continues in treaty making. Students then learn about the second important speech, which was then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd's national apology, and how such a momentous event in our country's history has also brought about very little change. And I love the quote here from Roxanne Moore, a human rights lawyer and Indigenous rights campaigner. And it reads, 10 years on from the national apology, we are still tackling the same issues. It's time for the government to listen to us, really listen to us. Now, this quote, while simplistic, really speaks to me, especially in reference to the culturally responsive evaluation framework for the New South Wales Department of Education. And one fundamental element of this is including Aboriginal peoples, their knowledges, their perspectives, their lived experiences as valued partners in moving forward, centering Aboriginal people as having jurisdiction over their own lives. And this, in this very simplistic form, is listening to them, just as the quote reads. And I also love this quote in 2008 from Kutcha Edwards, a singer-songwriter, which reads, leading up to the sorry moment, we were happy. Finally, we were getting recognition. Now there's so much negativity surrounding this momentous moment in time. It's like, so you got your apology. Aren't you happy now? All right. Students are then offered Greg's story, which was a personal account of Greg's experience, and it was included in the official Bringing Them Home report. And it details that in 1959, Greg was taken away from his family at the age of 12. And this powerful first-hand account reiterates to students the continued trauma and need to move forward in reconciliation. Now, if time is limited and you don't have the capacity to explore more from our Land Our Stories, I'd certainly recommend the above two stories, Indigenous Action for Indigenous Rights and Two Important Speeches for Reconciliation, as a good overall reflection on reconciliation, especially for senior students. Okay, and there are certainly a lot of complex issues that students have read about in this card, particularly through the lens of reconciliation. And I really love the entirety of the activities from page 32 of the upper primary student activity book. And we're seeing question 1, it really helps students scaffold their understanding of what they've explored in the story. I love question 2, where students are asked to reflect on the impacts of Paul Keating's Redfern speech. And then question 3, and students have opportunity to explain their understanding of the, quote, stuff, unquote, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are still dealing with today. And question 4, where students identify what their own school does in the journey of reconciliation, when they are asked to list ways they feel their school acknowledges the continued need for reconciliation and celebrates Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history. Okay, and you can see here on your screen the meaningful learning experiences from questions 5, 6, and 7 of the student activities. And I really love question 6, where students are scaffolded to take what they have learned from the reading card and link it with their own self-awareness. And again, you can use this question as is or modify them, as I have often done with student activities, to suit the experience that I'm providing for my students. All right. Now, as we move towards the end of our webinar, it is this next story, Moving Forwards, Moving Backwards, from the Upper Primary Country and Place Big Book, that I think gives students the truest essence of reconciliation in our country. It highlights to students that even though many felt comforted by the 2008 sorry speech, for countless Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, the effects of the stolen generations continue to be felt. The story talks of closing the gap within health and education. And while the gap is narrowing in some areas, in other areas things have become much worse. It then offers statistics to students whereby Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make up 3% of the Australian population, but 25% of the prison population. We learned that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples on average have shorter lives than non-Indigenous Australians, and people who live in remote parts of Australia often do not have access to the same quality of healthcare or education as people in cities. And now, with all this, I really love the last page of this story titled Looking Forward, which brings an affirmative tone to the story. It explains that despite the actions of colonisers and government policies, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples remain deeply connected to their country, culture, and communities. It reiterates the positives to students that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are now involved in all levels of government and education. Students read that today more Australians are learning about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories, cultures, and languages, and understand the effects that past government policies have had on Australia's First Peoples. And this is paramount to reconciliation, that students and teachers are being educated about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who, throughout history, have stood up for themselves, their people and country, despite extreme challenges. This is reconciliation in action. Okay, and the accompanying activities for this story from page 25 of the upper primary student activity book is a perfect way to conclude Reconciliation Week and National Sorry Day. And question 1, students are asked to use information and statistics from the story to reflect on the importance of closing the gap targets. Now, as is with the information presented in the story, we all know that closing the gap targets are far from being met. And this is a perfect question you could modify to speak of ways we are addressing failing closing the gap targets and how as part of moving forward in reconciliation. And then question 2, where even though we know there is a lot of work to be done now more than ever to tackle the unfinished business of reconciliation, students are asked to reflect on the positive steps Australia has made in acknowledging and celebrating First Nations history and continuing culture and traditions. Okay, now that brings us to the end of our webinar. Thanks so much for joining us today, and I hope that you feel a bit more informed in using our Land Our Stories to recognise National Sorry Day and Reconciliation 2024. And I'm actually very proud to announce the launch of my new business, 5 Emus Consultancy and Resources, which I am going to run alongside my teaching roles. So if you're looking for some whole school professional learning in using our Land, Our Stories in practice, as well as much, much more, please jump over to our new website, www.5emus.net.au. Thanks, Jasmine.
Thanks, Danielle, and congratulations on your new consultancy company. That's very exciting. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. We hope you found it very useful. If you'd like to view any of the Our Land, Our Stories resources, please do get in touch with your local learning consultant. They're always happy to help you out. As mentioned earlier, you will receive a copy of a recording of this webinar as soon as we can next week so that you can use it for National Reconciliation Week, along with the links to the 2 New South Wales syllabus overviews that Danielle mentioned. Thanks again for joining us today, and we hope you have a lovely afternoon and evening.